I'm going to be stripping down this brother linker. It doesn't want to advance. So the first thing I've done is on the underside, there were 3 screws that hold on the plastic cover located in the outer corners. Plastic cover is now loose, but still not quite ready to come off. Just have to pry up this knob, just using a flathead screwdriver. Can take the cover off. And we can see that this definitely needs a good strip down and clean. Using my usual supplies for my cleaning, trying to figure out why it isn't advancing. I think my main problem is getting it to go past the black lever on the side. Does come out of that groove on the plastic. What should be starting to happen is this metal piece should be engaging this plastic cog to rotate to the right, and I think that is where it is stuck. It doesn't want to advance, and I can't spin that with my hand. So the first area I'm going to look at is this part here. I can take this top plastic cover off. That just pops off, held in with 2 plastic pegs. And I will further on, once I've sorted this section, I'll then be able to take this circlip off and hopefully get in behind here to give it a better clean. Come in with a stiff brush first. And I can see as well that this small black wire here is in the wrong position. That needs to be located up behind this post. So that's one of the other things I will need to have a look at fixing. So I'm just dry brushing. I haven't put any cleaners or anything on at the moment. Dry brushing the worst of the grit, dust, whatever it is that's on here. So what I'm doing is I'm inspecting if I remove these 2 screws. What is this metal plate connecting to? So it's connected to this main plate, and when I look on the underside, it comes along the top of the plate, comes down through that hole, and this is the plate that we see, the rest of it that is on the top, and that is connected to all of this. So essentially, if I remove those 2 screws, this entire section would also remove. So what I'm doing is I'm just checking to see that nothing on this plate is tied in or secured with springs on anything else, which I don't think it is. So now that is loose. Now I need to get it out of that space. So in order to get it out of the space, I think I'll have to remove this plastic piece with this screw. So we'll try this one first. So that gives this a lot more free movement, that I'm able to swing it down and out of the way. Now it'll turn that way, which is good. That's what we want. So that isn't jammed, it does move. I will give this a proper clean before I put it back in. Now I'm going to come back here, and now I can see that does turn now. So the problem was between this connection point, this arm here, which has a small trip feeder here, which would push pushing the plastic peg on the wheel would cause this to turn, which has this presser pin which controls the stitch as it's brought off of the needle. It keeps it pressed down. So that could be due to this being too stiff to move for the arm, due to all the dirt and gunk that's in there. So now I do what I do best. I strip it all down into bits, taking care that I keep track of what screw is for what piece that is being removed. So whether you have enough space to methodically lay it out, or whether you have to go into the whole plastic pots that stack. A lot of these pieces will be pressed in, so there won't be anything to remove. Just be careful when you're taking off these little circlips, because they do like to ping. So just keep your finger over it using a fine flathead. That'll let it come off. I think the rest of this is just going to be coming in with cotton buds, toothpicks, and giving it a good clean. Again, you can use any cleaner that you have a preference to. I'm just using the WD-40 for an initial clean down. I'm not going to spray it and leave it to sit. I'm going to take as much of this WD-40 off again with the cloth and the cotton buds. So when you're cleaning pieces that move them to all of the different positions to make sure that you can have it cleaned effectively. If it can't come off, which some of these plates are harder to take off than others. So that is already moving a lot more smoothly. I'm just going to come in and do some final touch-ups in some of the tougher to reach areas. Again, we want to make sure that we take any of the excess away. Some parts are going to be hard to get to, and sometimes the marks aren't going to come away. Final thing I want to do is just try and get this plastic cog cleaner, because that is part of the driving mechanism and I don't want things building up. So I'm just going to cause it to rotate and brush out any of the black mess in there. Now the little spring that helps this lever come back into place has come off whilst I've been cleaning, so I'm just going to stretch that back up, keep that lever down and just pressure this pin. Might not pick up so well on camera because it is very fine, but you can see it just reaching over the top. I need to get that stretched back into the top area of the lever so that now it is under tension and it will return when this mechanism, so that's what stops the reverse movement, only allows it to go in one direction and it'll click into place. So now I can come over to this cog, which I can see is fairly dirty as well. Now this being a plastic piece, I am going to use my Dettol spray, which has an alcohol content in it, and I'm going to use my soft bristle toothbrush to just give this a bit of a scrub. And double check that all of the teeth in this cog are clear of any residue or build up. And when I'm happy with that, I can put this back on. I can put this little spring guide back on after it's had a wipe down. Just pay attention to this black spring leaf. The notch has to go in. There's a little tab on this spring leaf that locates into that notch. So that has to go in there. But for it to seat nicely in that notch and line up with the hole, the leaf spring isn't sitting in the correct position. So you may have to kind of press it down so that it is under the plastic pegs and force it up into position for the screw. So now, as this turns, that wheel, make sure we've got the timing correct, which I don't think we do, so I'm going to have to try and lift this away. This is to do with the teeth being in the right position when the spring leaf is in place. So I'm going to loosen that slightly in hopes that it will let me push this forward. And when these two plastic pegs are flat, the back piece should be lined up in its starting position. So when it's in its starting position, line up the cogs, and now when I move the wheel, each quarter rotation of the front cog completes a full rotation in the back. So we know this is clean, we know this is timed back how it should be. Final thing we need to replace on that is this little circlip, which will keep the plastic cog in on the post. I'm going to come back over to the final piece that I took off of this section, which was the little guide. And again, being plastic, I'm just going to give it a spray down with the Dettol spray. And if there are any stubborn parts, any little crevices, give it a spray and come in with this toothbrush to dislodge it. And then I can come back, place this in where it needs to be. So the metal bar slides into the back channel and goes through the slot, and I can replace the screws to secure it in place. Now you'll notice that the metal plate has oval holes, which allows for some adjustment in this plastic piece. Put the screws down to a point where it can still be adjusted, and I'm just going to adjust it slightly more forward. The plastic edge isn't quite in line with the metal, so I haven't pulled it all the way over. I've pushed it back on itself by a few millimeters, and that's where I'm going to tighten it down. Little past finger tight. Again, this is metal screws going into plastic, so we don't want to strip the thread, and that section is complete. Coming back to this little guide from the front, the screw that is in the plastic casing is loose, and this metal plate on the top is clipped into place from the side and then secured in with a small screw again. So to get all the crevices cleaned on this, I'm going to remove this small screw. I'll have to lift it because it is located on a raised peg area that is the same thickness as the metal plate. So I will have to lift as I slide it to the side, and then pivot it off to clear the edge. Once again, we're on plastic, so in with the blue cloth, soft brush, and I want to get in to all of the grooves with this to get it cleared off. And then just come back and buff it off any excess. The back side might be a little bit more tricky because it has all of these grooves. Again, you can come in with a cotton bud. I find this skewer with the cloth wrapped around it just as helpful. And the metal plate, I'm just going to give it a wipe down with my metal cloth, which is the purple one, which will have a small residue of WD-40. And if I find any sections that have some stubborn residue, now this could be the start of rust, it could just be old grease that doesn't want to come off, then a light spray into the cloth and then rub it over. And if it is rust pitting, then I would suggest you go in with a wire brush if it is still being stubborn to remove. So now I can replace this back on, clipping it into the side, pivot it round and sliding it into place. Small screw back in so that that metal plate doesn't come back out, and make sure to pair this back with its screw to secure back onto the main carriage section. So now I'm going to have a look at how to take apart the rest of the carriage. So I think I'll stick with focusing on this front section to have cleaned up. And ideally, we have the part that the needle is secured onto here, but when you inspect that plate that the plastic section of this needle is fixed to, that plate runs all the way back up in to the main section. So it would be pointless of me to remove this screw, since it runs all the way up into here and is held in by this black post away in the back under the wheel. So to get the needle off, it is these two screws in the front, and then there's not much else I can take off in that guide section. Now the next thing is I'm looking at this and processing how to break it down effectively without accidentally causing something to spring off when I don't want it to. I look at the circlip on this post to get this wheel off, to get underneath here, to give it a better clean. And I can see attached to this wheel, this plate, which again is running under and connected through to the other side. But I can also see this plate is held in with a lug, which is the main plate, and I can see that there is a spring secured onto a post from it, which again goes to another post which runs to the inside of the carriage and is somewhere under here. So I think what I'll do is I'll take this spring leaf off, and then I'll have a look on the underside to see what I can clear off the underside without interfering with the top side. And I'd imagine the underside is going to be this plastic guide plate, which will let me see further in. So it's going to be 3 screws off of this to take this off, and 1 screw off of this metal leaf. Now, I can already tell something isn't right as I'm unscrewing this, because it seems to be taking forever to unscrew. When I come back to the top, you'll be able to see what that is. This spring here is actually secured to that screw. So I've just popped it off just now, and that's fine. When it comes to reassembling this, I'll need to remember this little black pin will need to go on top of it. But for the moment, just so I don't lose that spring, I'm going to thread it off, and I'm going to set it over onto the right side of my table because it comes from the right side of the carriage. And I'm going to have a quick look on this side and see if this post is securing anything, which it isn't, so it should be fine to go ahead and continue removing these. I will have to remember the order that they are placed in. I think it will be pretty obvious for this screw because it is a lot longer than the one I took out. So all I've done when I've put the screws up out of the way is I've put the screw, rather than have it in a closed pile, I've placed the top screw at the top, the left screw to the left, so I've kept the same configuration where I've placed it down. So now this is again still secured with something. All I'm doing is having a look to see what, and I can now see that this isn't just a flat plate stuck on the underside, it actually comes up and through into this area. So I can't really take anything else off at the moment because it is all secured in through this top wheel. The crunch is going to be to take this circlip off and attempt to get the wheel off. What I'm doing is I'm just inspecting what is slotted in where, so that at that position for the timing everything has its slot and does a function at a particular moment in this plastic cam, that I want to make sure that I take note of what is placed in where before I go ahead and release. So the main thing stopping this from coming off is this top post. So by removing this, and this is probably going to be very hard to remove, it's highly unlikely you'll go to this extent, but if the item is as dirty as this, my preference is definitely to remove it. So I can see as I'm unscrewing that screw, something is moving underneath. So I'm going to stop, turn it over, have a look at what it is in control of. It's a small metal plate that isn't attached to anything else underneath, so I'm okay to go ahead and continue removing this. Whilst I'm here, I am going to go ahead and remove that front needle. That hasn't done anything to allow me to move this plate. That's okay. I know the plate can come forward out of the way, and that it is controlled to automatically release back to this position because we have this spring from this raised post to this raised post, which goes through. Does it go through? No, the raised post is part of the main plate. So I'm going to remove the spring. So that wasn't all that was controlling that, it's just an extra layer. Something else keeps that springing back into place, which is on the underside, and we have a very stiff spring in here which controls this bar. So I'm just having a look to see what this is connected to. I can see the screw here connects to a plate. That plate comes up and around the back, holds a rod with a spring, and this cantilevered section here, which reaches through to the other side, and that is this raised grey post there, which is what helps it flick back into position. Little springs come off on the other side, so we'll keep that safe. If I remove that, make sure that it doesn't control anything on the other side. There's nothing attached to it. If I remove this, loose, but looking closer again, it actually goes up through to the other side, and it is just a securing slot that it is in. So ideally, if I push to the side, there we go, that should let me drop that out of place. Okay, so that was just to the other side of the spring. There's a little T slot, that's where that was coming up through and then slid across to secure itself on, and then it would come up in here to control this, to allow that whole plate to spring back into place. So now the initial spring from this post here has been removed, and the cantilevered piece on the underside's been removed. This now is able to be kept out of place to allow me to remove the top wheel. Now the top wheel, as I've lifted that off, this piece here has sprung back. Just here. And the reason that has sprung back, that I can see, is this long spring. So if I remove this long spring, that will fall forward. And again, I'm going to remove the spring off totally so that it doesn't get lost or damaged. And that allows me much better access to come in and give this a better clean. So just dry brush, loose lint, anything that's in here that doesn't need to be, lots of dirt on the grease, the old grease. And again, I can see that this whole piece, because I unscrewed from the underside, is all loose. That top arm is on a post, so that should now let me drop that away. So we're right down to the bare plate now. Plenty of access now to get all of the parts where it's all grimy brushed out, cleaned off, and I'll decide if I want to then move up here, sort this, reassemble, and then go back through reassembling everything. So this is the little spring that we were looking at before that wasn't seated properly. That was on the underside of that post, which was connected on to here. So I'm going to keep that with that piece. I'm going to continue working. Again, I've sprayed this. I'm not going to leave it like that. I'm going to take away as much of the residue as I can. main purpose of this is just to lift away any of the dirt that is ingrained into the metal because of the grease. Now it is likely you will have to come in here with a brush as well. You can see this little brush attachment here is held in place with a fine screw, so I can come ahead and take this out. And I can see that inner plate. I could remove the whole thing to clean in between, which I think would be better in this instance. So I have the circlip on the post. Which has a washer on there. And then I have this screw at the front. So this black post had a washer and a circlip, and then this screw at the front, that is this single plate that is on the underside. So when I remove that screw, and again that has a sliding spacer, so I'll keep that to the front. That should let that piece fall out. Okay, much better access now. And again, you can see how much residue of the WD-40 falls through there. So ideally, getting the plates off to get everything clean means that nothing will sit and congeal. As you're cleaning things off, make sure that you move any parts that do still move and then clean in the other position. Now this part can't come off because it is pressed on with these rivets and there's no way to remove these. Making sure each time you move it, you give it a wipe, and that helps to mop up any excess that is between the two plates. I can see that there is still some work for me to do with this top section, just because of how grubby this entire piece is. But when I have an item that is this dirty, because it hasn't been in a box, because it hasn't been looked after, it's been stored in a garage or it's been uncovered, it does need a good strip down. So, and unfortunately I haven't been able to source a service manual for this linker carriage. You can find it for the main machines, yes, no problem, but I haven't been able to source an exploded diagram of this, so this is entirely new for me. And I can see these buttons are pressed onto a metal plate which goes behind this black plate and has a groove with a pin, and that pin in the top probably comes through into here on this black section. So as I'm moving the red buttons that control the long metal silver plate, it moves this pin, which is probably in the back section, up or down, and that comes back through to the front, which controls this black plate. I am going to have to deconstruct a little bit further for this. So I can see that this is pressed on to the metal plate. So I'm just levering this up. Now, the first left-hand button wasn't secured in with any spring. The right-hand one is. It has a little leg, and threaded onto that is a spring. we're going to lift that off, lever the button off, pull that spring off to the side. Now I can already see, to get this black plate off, there is a thin nut to undo, which is on that screw at the back, and that also holds in this nut, which would release that back plastic casing, and it would release the silver plate at the back and this black plate at the front. Now the black plate won't lift off because this black piece is holding it in place. It's like a T-bar again. But I would imagine once this is loose, that black post, which is probably this plate on the back, which is kept in position with the plastic runner, if that comes away, then they'll be able to slide that down to the groove to push out, and the only thing left is the spring connecting it and this plastic guide here on the side that might get in the way of pulling it out of that slot, but I don't think it should. So I'm going to take that spring off the back, put it with the little one that shared this post that went to the button. Now what I'm checking for now is by undoing this, and that plate, the black plate on the top, the silver plate that runs along the back, and the black plate on the bottom, what will happen to the spring section that is left here. I can see this is all controlled from a leg which is attached to the main plate over to this piece of metal, goes through a post. That post is circlipped, which holds this lever. So by removing these two screws, I might not get the plastic piece off because this long arm covers. But if it does, then we'll come back and we'll disassemble all of this, take the circlip off on the back and take it right down to the bare plate. Right, I have been able to lever it up out of the way. So now that is loose. Let's have a look at this plate on the back. Can that come forward? So the main piece that is holding is that T-bar. So I wonder if it is just a case of prying the post out. So you can see why spraying it and leaving it with the WD-40 isn't ideal. Ideally, you want to get all of the layers off and get that excess wiped up. And I'm just coming in with the cotton bud to reach in for this arm to clean off the excess. So final step before the reassembly process is just to wipe all of the plates before they're reinstalled. We put the silver bar on first. We've manoeuvred in the black section in over the post, but it goes underneath the silver arm. And the final piece is this part with the post and the T-section, which have to come up through and slide up into position. So it's just a case of pressing the plates together until that slots into place. So now moving this back and forward. engages and disengages the black plate, which locks on to the carriage, to the bed. I'm going to place it in. Make sure that the arm is front of the guide area, and then we're going to want to push through screws, and we're going to want to ensure that we use the correct nut. Narrower depth of nut goes on the side where there is only one plate, and the deeper depth nut will go on the side where the black and the silver and the main plate. So I'm going to press that in and tighten this down, finger tight. So essentially the top of that screw should be flush with the top of the nut. Repeat on the other side. Perfect. So now I'm going to come back in, reattach the springs. Before I put the buttons back on, I'm probably going to give them a clean. Press them on to the posts. Last spring to install to the button on the right. So the next section that I'm going to take a look at cleaning is the plastic piece that came off. Again, I'm going to get rid of that little spring just so that I don't lose it. And that's obviously wanting to lift away. So this is all plastic. It's going to need a really good clean. The little nut that is loose goes with the raised edge up the way into that little slot, which then creates a locating point for that section. And again, this little piece of wire goes on that post. Still got some other bits here that need a good clean off. So now I'm ready to start putting the rest of it back together. Hopefully we can look at getting the plastic piece put back on. I'm going to locate this little brush. It has one locating pin and one screw hole. I know it come from the front area. Again, it does have oval slots, so you will be able to loosen it slightly and adjust it either way. This plastic piece is to go back up into that section. Again, take that spring off because it goes on top. So what we're trying to make sure is this is seated when we put it up through that this post clears the hole properly. That obviously has to be able to move. And now I want to secure it at least in one area. So I'm going to use this top screw first, and then we can look at coming in and bringing back in the other sections. So this long arm, all I've done is located it into the pen, made sure it's gone around the right side of the brush. So I've got this spacer with the screw and the washer and the circlip. Washer first, then the circlip. And once it's ready to go into the groove on the post, I'm going to move it up out of the way, come in with the pliers and squeeze, trying to ensure that I'm only catching the circlip and not the washer behind. So that is now locked in place, and that moves nice and smoothly. Now we know this arm was lifted out of this post. It is the trigger mechanism for the first piece that we cleaned. We know it needs to go back in there. We have to remember this little spring. that we took out of its place. So that gets seated on the post along with this, and we want to ensure the short tail of the spring goes in front of the arm that drops, and the long tail will come back here to secure behind the screw that gets put through from the back. If I turn this over, find that long screw. Now that is still going to want to lift off regardless because it isn't held in place at the minute. The next thing is reinstalling some springs, and we'll also have this cantilever piece that we will need to clean up and reinstall on the underside. So I think I'll do that first before I do the springs. And we know that the little T section on the end has to get located in here, and the pin has to come up into the front section. So again, I'm just going to lift that piece off so that it isn't in the way. It might be a little bit fitted because you are fighting a spring-loaded arm on that piece, but once you've got it up through the slot, lined up, push it over and just make sure that encircles the posts of that piece that we've just slotted up and through. And then we'll be ready to secure that down from the underside. Again, there is some adjustment on this. It is an oval slot. We have a piece to fit in from the underside. It gets located on with two raised pins sort of between the plastic brush holder and the arm. Make sure they all face the same way towards the needle. Hold that in place and secure it. So I'm going to put on some of the springs that had come off. The long spring goes on the right hand side and comes down to this front piece. Now you may want to leave this off once you get back to being ready to install the top plastic disc, because that needs to be in a lower position for the disc to stay in place. The rest of it is all springs, and then it's the plastic disc. So I'm going to give this a clean before I go any further. Now that bottom section will lift off, so there is more to clean in there. Again, if there is any stubborn bits in crevices or corners, give it a spray and come in with your brush. I think that will do it for that piece. You have the centre post has two flat edges, so it'll either go on this way, but the posts don't line up, so you'll know it has to go the other way. So the flat edges and the two posts go in place. So there's not really a way that it'll allow you to seat it incorrectly for that part. Now I have actually realised that that spring is on wrong. I sat it this way. It needs to be sat this way so that it hooks onto the pieces. So I'm going to hook it on the post over the back of that screw, and then when I put on that top metal piece on the post, I need to ensure as I drop it down that I use a pair of tweezers to keep the metal spring held back out of the way, providing you don't knock it off. So before I drop that down, I'm going to hold that spring back out of the way, and then I'm going to drop it in place. That way, that is spring loaded. That is what I want, because that is the action that we need this arm to do. We need it to pivot here to turn the cog that is from that front section. So next up we need to get the cog in place and we need to reset everything. So what I'm looking to do is have the front post pulled forward, this secondary post pulled forward, which I'll probably end up using my thumb to hold there. Placing this on, my middle finger on the right is keeping the tension on that arm pressed in. What we're trying to do is get it in the right position. So I know that the very front post needs to sit at the very front of this piece. So again, let's just readjust here. Push that down. So controlling this screw is this very front black post in behind the metal piece that holds the plastic cam in place. I want that to sit on the outer edge. As it turns, it's going to go around and then it's going to drop in to this slot. So looking at some of the parts I have left, I have this big chunky spring that I know come off of this side to the screw that went through. This will be stiff to get over. Okay. And I also have a spring to place back in on these two sections. So I have the post here from this plate that holds the plastic piece to reach back inside to a secondary post, which is the main carriage plate. So I might end up using my tweezers to get in there and lay it on that inside post first, and then stretch it out over to the outside post. And the final thing is on the underside. I need to put the last screw in on the plastic plate. And the spring leaf, again, it has a little locating lug which goes into the slot on the side, and then the hole for the screw to keep it in place. So I'm going to line up the pin for the starting position, which should put that notch where the spring leaf locks into, and then I'm going to tighten that down. The last thing to fit on to secure that back in place is the circlip. Now it should turn. Yes. Final bit to put back in is this cog area. Okay, so now that should move. Perfect, and it should rotate the cog, which it does smoothly. Last bits are the needle needs to go back in, and then the last bit is this front guide. Okay, so that's the mechanical side of it, all done and dusted. So now I need to come in for the top cover and give that a clean. Top disc cover goes on first and is pressed into place. Top cover. Push fit that on, and then It's the last 3 screws to secure the plastic casing to the underside of the carriage. We can take it to the machine and test it. The back piece moves fine. The main section we want to test is that it walks properly as we turn, and then we'll want to test with some knitting to cast off or to join. I'll probably put a little bit of oil in that runner and in that section there, just the tiniest amount, and also on the front section here. But other than that, I think we now have a nice clean working linker. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, and until the next time, you've been watching Button Mouse the Wee Machine Knitter.